Apologize now." The command wasn't loud, but it possessed a razor-like quality that sliced through the ambient noise of the room, sharper and more precise than any outburst of anger. I watched as the glass in his hand stalled halfway to his lips. His eyes didn't flicker with curiosity or confusion. Instead, they remained locked on me with a chilling, absolute certainty. It was the look of a man who had just recognized a ghost he thought he'd never see again. Then Mark laughed. It wasn't a nervous sound, nor was it particularly polite. It was a short, dismissive chuckle of someone who thought he was still in control of the room. "Come on, Uncle Frank," Mark said, shaking his head. "It's just a nickname." In that moment, I knew the evening was over. Not just the dinner or the idle conversation, but something much deeper. Something quiet and fragile had broken, and it wasn't the kind of thing you could ever truly put back together. A few hours earlier, I had come close to turning the car around. I sat in my SUV outside the house in Fairfax, Virginia, letting the engine idle much longer than necessary. The neighborhood was a quintessential slice of the American dream built in the late 80s. Two-story colonials, perfectly manicured hedges, and American flags hanging limp from front porches. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's grocery store runs and waved from their driveways with practiced ease. Normal. That word had always felt like a borrowed garment to me, something I could put on for a while, but never truly own. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was pulled back tightly, and I wore a light touch of makeup I'd had to relearn how to apply. My navy blouse felt restrictive, a costume that didn't quite fit the person underneath. There was no uniform today, no rank insignia, no tactical gear, just a woman trying to navigate a family dinner. "Just dinner," I whispered to my reflection, exhaling slowly. "I've handled far worse than this." Inside, the house was a sensory overload of domesticity. The savory aroma of roast chicken and garlic mingled with the scent of something sweet baking in the oven. The lighting was warm, the air filled with the overlapping melodies of family voices, the rhythmic clink of silverware, and the booming laughter of someone in the kitchen. My sister-in-law, Jenna, was the first to spot me. "Evie, you actually made it." She crossed the room in a blur and wrapped me in a hug before I could even brace myself. I stood there for a beat longer than social grace dictated, then finally returned the embrace. "Wouldn't miss it," I lied. It was a harmless enough deception, but Jenna didn't need to know the effort it took just to walk through the front door. She pulled me into the living room, introducing me to a blur of faces and names that I lost almost immediately. There were cousins, in-laws, and neighbors who had been around so long they were considered family. Smiles were exchanged and polite nods given, but I noticed the quick glances that lingered a second too long. People always looked twice at me, not because they knew my history, but because they sensed a void where a typical suburban story should be. My presence made them curious, and curiosity is a dangerous thing. I first saw Mark leaning against the doorframe between the living and dining rooms. He was my brother-in-law, Jenna's husband, and he carried that easy, unearned confidence that some men wear like a second skin. With his arms crossed and a half-smile playing on his lips, he was already deep into a conversation about golf or investment portfolios, topics that felt like they were from a different planet than mine. When Jenna introduced us, he gave me a slow, measuring look. It wasn't overtly rude, but it was clinical. "So, you're the famous Evie," he said. "I heard you were Navy." I gave a brief nod. "Was retired already?" he asked, his eyebrows arching. "You don't look old enough for a pension." "I'm not." He chuckled, as if we were already in on a private joke. "Must have been a desk job then." "Pushing papers at the Pentagon?" I didn't offer a response. Silence has a way of forcing people to reveal themselves, but Mark just shrugged and turned back to his conversation, satisfied that he'd already figured me out. I didn't mind. Most people prefer the version of me they invent in their own heads. Dinner began around 6 p.m. The long wooden table was set with precision, white plates, cloth napkins folded just so, and an air of forced occasion. I chose a seat near the middle, neutral ground. Across from me sat an older man I hadn't met. He looked to be in his late 70s or early 80s, possessed of a remarkably straight posture and eyes that remained clear and sharp. His hands were steady as he lifted his wine glass. He didn't speak much at first, he just watched. It wasn't the suspicious gaze of a stranger, but the knowing look of a peer. The conversation started with the usual trivialities: the weather, the traffic on the I-95, the upcoming wedding that weekend. Jenna and Mark's how we met story was trotted out for the benefit of the older relatives, who enjoyed the repetition. I listened more than I spoke. In my old life, listening was a survival skill. Here, it just made people think I was shy. Inevitably, the conversation shifted from the general to the personal. "So, Evie," someone from the end of the table called out, "what exactly did you do during your time in the Navy?" It was a simple enough question. I took a measured sip of water before answering. "Special operations." Usually, that was enough to end the inquiry. Most people didn't understand the term, and those over a certain age knew better than to pry. But Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, sharp interest. "Special ops, huh?" There was that tone again, curious, but with an edge of skepticism. "What does that mean in plain English?" "Various assignments," I replied. He smirked. "Sounds classified." I gave a small, non-committal shrug. "Some of it is." A few people offered polite, uneasy chuckles, but Mark didn't. He tilted his head, studying me as if I were a puzzle he was determined to solve for his own amusement. "So, you're a sailor in the Navy," he said, his voice dripping with mock gravitas. Then he delivered the line. "What was your nickname?" "Every operator has a cool call sign, right?" The room didn't go silent immediately. There is always a brief window, that tiny, breathless space where a conversation can still be saved. I could have deflected. I could have made a joke about paper cut or changed the subject to the roast chicken. But I didn't. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him the truth. "Mad dog." A few people laughed light, uncertain sounds, as if they thought I was playing along with Mark's sarcasm. But then I saw the man across from me. Uncle Frank. His glass stopped dead halfway to his mouth. His eyes never left mine. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. "Apologize now." Frank's voice was low, but it had a resonance that made the silverware seem to vibrate. Every side conversation at the table died. Mark blinked, his smirk faltering. "Excuse me?" The old man didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You heard me. Apologize." Mark let out a short, forced laugh, glancing around the table as if looking for someone to join him in his confusion. "Uncle Frank, come on. It's just a joke." "I didn't say anything." "Yes, you did." The words landed with a heavy finality. Mark's smile finally vanished. For the first time that evening, someone else in the room understood exactly what had just happened. I set my fork down gently on the porcelain plate. "I'm fine, Frank," I said quietly. But Uncle Frank didn't look at me. His gaze remained anchored on Mark. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not." The conviviality of the dinner evaporated. No one reached for their fork. The roast chicken began to cool, and the green beans sat untouched, their toasted almonds glistening under the chandelier. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer began to beep incessantly until Jenna hurried away to silence it. Even that mundane sound felt jarring in the sudden vacuum of the room. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I had lived through heavy gunfire, the deafening roar of rotor wash, and radio chatter so loud it felt like it was rattling my teeth, but I had learned that the heaviest moments in life often happen in a room where no one says a word. Mark looked from Frank to me and back again, his face reddening. "What is this? Seriously, did I miss something here?" Uncle Frank finally set his glass down with deliberate care. His face had gone still, adopting an expression I recognized instantly. It was the look men of his generation wore only when a memory had taken a firm, iron grip on them. "You asked her that question like it was a punchline," Frank said. Mark spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "It was just a question." "It was a challenge," Frank countered. I could feel every eye at the table darting between us. Jenna returned from the kitchen, took one look at the frozen tableau, and stopped in her tracks. "What happened?" No one answered for a long moment. Then Mark spoke up, his voice tight. "Apparently, I've committed a crime by asking your sister what her nickname is." "Sister-in-law," Jenna corrected reflexively, then looked at me with concern. "Evie?" "I'm all right," I said. It was true on the surface. I wasn't scared or even particularly angry. I was just tired, the kind of soul-deep fatigue that has nothing to do with a lack of sleep. The thing about nicknames in my world is that civilians think they're stories they're entitled to hear, something colorful to entertain them at a party. They want a little badge of danger they can admire from a safe distance. But some names are just receipts. They are proof of what something cost you. Frank drew in a long breath and looked at me directly. Did I hear you right? I nodded once. You did. He held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than most people could endure. Then he leaned back in his chair, and I watched the realization register in his eyes all over again. It wasn't excitement or admiration, it was recognition. The kind that doesn't make a person feel bigger, but makes the room feel much, much smaller. My mother used to say that older Americans carry history differently. They aren't louder about it, they just carry it deeper. They know what it means when a name causes the air to go still. Frank was that kind of man. Mark, conversely, had never had to learn the value of stillness. Mark shrugged, trying to regain his footing. Okay, someone help me out, because now I'm actually curious. That's part of your problem, Frank said. The words were plain, but they hit hard enough to make Jenna wince. Uncle Frank, she said softly, maybe we should all just calm down. I am calm. And he was. That was the unsettling part. His wasn't a hot, impulsive anger. It was the cold, tempered resentment of an old man who had seen enough of life to know the exact weight of disrespect. Across the table, Aunt Louise cleared her throat. Frank, do you know Evie from somewhere? He shook his head. No, not personally. But I know the name. I felt my shoulders tighten, even as I kept my expression neutral. I had spent years training my body not to announce my discomfort, a habit that remains long after the danger has passed. Mark caught Frank's sentence and tried to make light of it again. Oh, come on. What is this? Some kind of urban legend? A ghost story from the halls of the Pentagon? No one laughed. That was the moment Mark's face finally changed. The first pale edge of realization dawned on him, not because he understood the significance of the nickname, but because he realized he was utterly alone in how he was handling it. Frank folded his napkin and laid it precisely beside his plate. I served in Vietnam, he said. Different Navy, different century. But I stayed in touch with enough people over the years to know when a name is spoken with a certain kind of caution. I looked down at my water glass. There are moments when you want to disappear, and people always assume it's because of shame. Usually, it's the opposite. It's because you know that once a room starts looking at you a certain way, they stop seeing the person. They stop seeing the woman who forgot to bring the pie server she promised, or the one who sat in her car for 10 minutes just trying to find the nerve to come inside. They start seeing a story instead. And stories are dangerous things when they no longer belong to you. I heard that name years ago, Frank continued. Not from the news or the television. It came up in conversations where people didn't use names lightly. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You're making this sound ridiculous. Am I? Mark opened his mouth to retort, then closed it. Jenna sat down slowly, her food untouched, her wine forgotten. Evie, she said, her voice softer now. Is this real? The nickname? Yes. Her brow furrowed. Why did you never mention it? I gave her a tired, thin smile. Because this is dinner, Jenna. Not a deposition. That earned a few uneasy smiles around the table, not laughter, but a collective sigh of relief that some semblance of normal rhythm had returned. But Mark wasn't ready to let the bone go. So, what? I'm supposed to apologize because she has some tough-sounding nickname from work? I turned to him then. I shifted my entire body so that he had no choice but to meet my eyes fully. You don't owe me, I said, my voice steady and low. But you owe people respect before you decide they're lying to you. That silenced him. I hadn't raised my voice, but I had learned that a calm, unwavering tone can shame a person far more effectively than a shout ever could. Frank nodded once, almost to himself. That's right, he said. And for what it's worth, son, some names aren't for bragging. They're warning labels. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't frozen, it was expectant. Outside, the sweep of headlights moved across the front window as a neighbor pulled into their driveway. Somewhere upstairs, a toilet flushed. Real life continued to move around us, which somehow made the tension at the table feel more grounded, more real. This is how these moments happen in America, not on a battlefield or in a movie, but at a polished dining table in Northern Virginia, next to a bowl of mashed potatoes and a half-finished basket of rolls. Mark looked at his plate for a long time before he finally spoke. "I wasn't trying to insult you," he muttered. "I believe that," I said. He looked up, surprised by my lack of vitriol. "But," I continued, "not trying and not doing are two different things." That seemed to penetrate his defenses more than Frank's sharpness had. People over 60 know this truth well. Pride doesn't usually shatter all at once. It cracks a little at a time. Frank leaned back, his expression easing just a fraction. "You asked her to perform," Frank said. "That's what you did. And some people have paid a very high price to provide amusement for a dinner table." No one moved for several seconds. Then, Aunt Louise reached for the green beans and quietly passed them to Jenna, a silent plea to resume the meal and the safety of the mundane. It almost worked. But then Mark looked at Frank and asked the one question that kept the evening from settling back into its groove. "How do you know that name?" Frank's eyes drifted back to me. I knew before he even opened his mouth that this night was about to go much deeper than I ever intended. Frank didn't answer immediately. At his age, silence wasn't a sign of hesitation, it was an act of judgment. He was weighing what belonged in this room and what should remain in the dark. That alone told me everything I needed to know about him. Most people, when they think they possess a piece of extraordinary information, hurry to show it off. Frank understood that information has weight, and weight can crush people. I decided to save him the trouble. "You don't have to explain it, Frank." His eyes stayed on mine. "Maybe not. But maybe I should." Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, not a laugh this time, but a sign that his patience was fraying. "This is unbelievable." "No," Frank said. "It's very believable." That's the problem. The room had shifted into one of those strange family moments where everyone feels trapped between the requirements of politeness and the magnetism of the truth. Jenna looked like she wanted to smooth everything over with dessert. Aunt Louise was obsessively folding her napkin. Frank rested his forearms on the table. "I spent 30 years after Vietnam working around veterans organizations, military charities, and a few federal contractors," he said. "You hear things. Not gossip, just enough to know which stories carry weight." Mark frowned. "So, this is just hearsay?" Frank ignored the bait. Every now and then a name would come up. Never in detail, never in a way that invited follow-up questions. It was just a shorthand among people who understood what it meant when a mission went sideways and someone still managed to bring their people home. My jaw tightened. I hated hearing it framed that way, not because it was factually wrong, but because it was incomplete. People love clean, heroic versions of ugly things, especially when they're sitting at a dinner table. Jenna looked at me, her eyes filled with a tentative apology. "Evie, is any of that true?" I kept my voice flat. "Some of it." Mark seized on that instantly. "Some of it. That means enough," Frank said. Mark leaned back and crossed his arms. It was the same posture he'd had when I arrived, but it looked different now, less like confidence, more like a shield. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words sounded more like a formality than a feeling. "I just have a hard time with this." She comes to dinner, says maybe 10 words, and suddenly everyone is acting like she's some kind of legendary war hero. I looked him straight in the eye. "I didn't ask anyone to do that." "No," he countered, "but you could clear it up." That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. He didn't want the drama, he wanted certainty. People of his generation often think certainty is a birthright. Those over 60 usually know better. They know that the truth often comes in jagged, ugly pieces, and you either respect the edges or you get cut. Frank spoke before I could. "You want her to satisfy your curiosity," he said. "That isn't the same thing as clearing it up." Mark's face flushed deep red. "I just want to know if we're all being played here." That hit harder than he probably intended. I saw Jenna close her eyes for a moment. I should have been angry 10 years ago, I would have been. But anger requires energy, and by 35, I had already spent my reserves on things that mattered much more than Mark's ego. "I'm not playing anyone," I said quietly. "And I have no interest in convincing you." He looked at me as if my lack of engagement was more frustrating than if I'd screamed at him. Then why say it at all? He asked. Mad dog. Why not just brush the question off? Because you asked. Frank gave a tiny, imperceptible nod, as if that was the exact answer he expected. Aunt Louise spoke up tentatively. Frank, what exactly did you hear? He was silent for a moment, letting the memory of the name settle. That's not an answer, Mark pressured. No, Frank replied. But it's the only answer you're getting. A younger cousin at the far end of the table, Caleb, a boy in his early 20s, cleared his throat. Was it, like, from Afghanistan or something? I looked at him. He had that look young people get around military stories, half respectful, half shaped by Hollywood. He wasn't mocking. He was just trying to find a frame of reference. Overseas, I said. Well, that narrows it down, Mark muttered. Frank turned on him with surprising intensity. Would you listen to yourself for one damn second? Mark stared back, startled. I'm just asking questions. No, you're trying to win an argument. That took the wind out of Mark's sails. It also settled something in me. Frank wasn't defending a myth. He was defending a principle, that some people have earned the right not to be poked and prodded for the sake of dinner table entertainment. Jenna looked between us. Evie, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew you served, and I knew it was serious, but I didn't. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. Her eyes softened. Why? I glanced down at my plate. My food was cold now. Because when you tell civilians too much, they either turn it into a movie or they start backing away from you in the church parking lot. Silence followed that statement, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. In a room full of family, it was perhaps the loneliest sentence I had uttered in years. Frank was the one to break the quiet. There was talk of a rescue operation, he said carefully. That's all I ever heard. A bad situation. Bad enough that people who knew better stopped talking whenever that name came up. Mark's mouth tightened. So, there's no actual proof. I looked at him steadily. You need proof because you still think this is about status. He opened his mouth to speak, but I kept going. It's not. That nickname wasn't something I chose. It wasn't a trophy I won. It was what people started calling me after a mission that cost far too much. That did it. No dramatic gasps, no dropped glasses, just the room settling into the cold reality that whatever this was, it wasn't fun anymore. Frank's voice was barely audible. That's what I figured. Mark looked at me for a long, searching moment. For the first time all evening, the smugness left his face entirely. In its place was something more human, embarrassment, and perhaps a flicker of fear. Not fear of me, but fear of having waded into deep water thinking it was a puddle. Jenna reached over and placed a hand on his wrist. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. I didn't know, he said. I believed him. It didn't erase the damage, but it mattered. Most family wounds don't start with malice. They start with carelessness. Frank leaned back and exhaled. Well, now you do. With that, everyone understood that the evening had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. We had moved past spectacle into the realm of truth. Mark swallowed hard. What happened? On that mission? I looked down at my hands. I hadn't planned on telling them anything. But some nights choose their own path. There are questions that sound simple but aren't, questions that pull on threads you've spent years neatly tucking away. You don't hesitate because you're hiding. You hesitate because you know that once the story starts, you can't control how much of it comes out. And once it's out, it no longer belongs to you. The room waited. I could feel the expectation, not as pressure, but as a heavy stillness. Even Frank didn't intervene this time. He just watched, like a man who knew that sometimes the truth has to be spoken in its own time. I rested my hands flat on the table. It wasn't one single moment, I said. It never is. Mark didn't interrupt. The shift in him was total. It started like most operations do, I continued. Incomplete intel, time-sensitive. There were civilians involved, Americans, contractors, aid workers. People in the wrong place at the very worst time. Caleb leaned forward, silent. We were told it was a recovery mission, I said. In and out. Fast. Controlled. I let out a quiet breath. That's what it was supposed to be. Jenna's fingers tightened around her napkin as she braced herself for the rest. What happened? She asked softly. I looked at her, consciously avoiding Mark's gaze this time. We got there, I said, and it wasn't what we were told. That sentence hung in the air, lingering much longer than I had expected it to. Frank gave a small, knowing nod, the kind of gesture from someone who had seen his own share of bad intel. The layout was wrong, I continued, my voice steady. The number of people inside was wrong. The level of resistance. All wrong. You plan for variables, of course, but there's a fundamental difference between managing variables and being set up for something you were never prepared to handle. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes finally fixed on me, the skepticism starting to bleed out of his expression. Was it an ambush? He asked. Not exactly, I replied. But it was close enough that the distinction didn't matter. I could feel the memory pulling at me now, sharpening into focus, the sudden sounds, the oppressive heat, the strange way time stretches and then collapses all at once. We went in anyway, I said, because that's the job. You don't get the luxury of standing outside to argue with bad intel while people are waiting for you on the inside. The room went completely still. Nobody moved. We made contact, I continued. It was fast, loud, and incredibly confusing. You don't see things clearly in those moments. You see shapes and sudden movements. You hear voices, but they don't always make sense in the chaos. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. You rely on your training, and you rely on the people standing next to you. My voice slowed down. And when something goes wrong, you feel it in your gut long before you fully understand it. Jenna instinctively covered her mouth with her hand. What do you mean? She whispered. I looked down at the table, focusing on the grain of the wood. It means someone doesn't answer the radio when they should, I said. It means a position that was supposed to be covered is suddenly empty. It means you realize in a split second that the plan you walked in with is gone. Frank's eyes dropped briefly. He didn't need any more explanation. He knew exactly what that silence felt like. Mark shifted in his chair, his posture much quieter now. Did you lose people? Yes. I didn't try to soften the blow. There are some things you just don't dress up. The room seemed to shrink around that word. Aunt Louise whispered a soft, "Oh my lord." I continued, not because I wanted to relive it, but because stopping there would have left it as something worse, a half-told story prone to misunderstanding. The first attempt failed, I said. We had to pull back. Mark frowned, his old instincts flickering. You left? We had to, I said firmly. We were compromised, injured, and severely outnumbered. His expression tightened as if he were trying to reconcile what that meant against his own ideas of bravery. And the hostages? He asked. I held his gaze, refusing to blink. We left them there. Silence followed. It wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was heavy. Real. Caleb spoke up before he could catch himself. But you went back. I turned to look at him. Yes. Frank's jaw shifted slightly. He already knew that part of the story. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table again, but this time there was no arrogance left in the gesture. You went back alone? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. That was the detail people always focused on. Not the failure, not the horrific cost, just the singular decision that came afterward. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, I said. No one plans to go back in alone. That's not how the protocols work. Then how did it happen? Jenna asked. I took a slow breath. Because leaving them didn't sit right with me, I said. That was the simplest version of the truth, and the most honest one. There are moments, I continued, when you can follow your orders and still know you're going to carry the weight of that choice for the rest of your life. And then there are moments when you step outside of those orders and accept a different kind of consequence. Mark stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time. You disobeyed orders, he said. Yes. The word landed without an apology. Jenna looked stunned. Evie. I knew exactly what I was doing, I said. And I knew what it could cost me, and not just professionally. Frank spoke up quietly. But you went anyway. Yes. No one asked why a second time. They didn't need to. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the sudden exhaustion of the telling. It wasn't heroic, I said. It wasn't clean. It was messy, loud, and terrifyingly uncertain. And the only reason I'm sitting here talking about it now is because, by some miracle, it worked. I let that sit for a moment. Not perfectly, I added. Nothing like that ever is. Mark's voice was much lower now. You got them out. Yes. And that's why they called you. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, the weight of the nickname finally making sense. I shook my head slightly. That's why they called me that, I said, because I didn't stop. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Not in admiration, he murmured. In understanding, I finished for him. That's not a name people give lightly, he added. No, I said, it's not. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. No one was leaning back casually anymore. No one was wearing a polite, forced smile. The safe, comfortable distance that keeps civilian conversations easy had vanished. We were all sitting in something closer. Something much harder. Mark ran a hand over his face, looking weary. I thought, he began, then trailed off. What? I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was no performance in his expression. No ego. I thought you were exaggerating, he said quietly. I know. That answer seemed to surprise him. You do? Yes. Then why didn't you say anything? I gave him a small, tired smile. Because people usually don't hear things until they're actually ready to listen. Frank nodded one more time. That's the truth. Jenna reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine, hesitating as if she weren't sure she was allowed to touch the person I had become. Evie, I'm so sorry, she said. For what? For not knowing. For all of this. I shook my head. You weren't supposed to know, I said again. That part of my reality hadn't changed. But something else had. The room wasn't judging me anymore. It was listening. And Mark wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. It was a start. But we weren't finished yet. Because understanding what happened is one thing, understanding the cost is something else entirely. Nobody spoke for a while after that. You could feel the weight of what had been said settling into the room like dust after something breaks. It wasn't chaotic, it was just different. Heavier. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip of water. The coolness grounded me, bringing me back to the table, to the people sitting there, and to the fact that this wasn't a briefing room or a debriefing report that would eventually disappear into a secure file. This was family. Or at least, something trying to become family again. Mark cleared his throat. So, you just decided to go back, he asked. There was no challenge in his voice now, just a quiet, searching disbelief. I didn't decide it the way you're thinking, I said. It wasn't a grand speech or a dramatic moment. It was just a realization. What kind of realization? That I wasn't done, I said. He frowned, trying to piece the logic together. But you said the mission failed. It did. And you were ordered to pull out. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Then how do you justify going back? I looked at him carefully. I don't, I said. That stopped him cold. I don't justify it, I repeated. I live with it. That's the part most people don't expect. They want a clean answer, a moral reason they can agree with, something that makes everything line up neatly in their minds. But life doesn't work that way. Not at 35, and certainly not after enough years of seeing how decisions ripple outward. Frank spoke up softly from the head of the table. There's a vast difference between justification and responsibility. I nodded once toward him. Exactly. Mark leaned back, absorbing that distinction. So you went back knowing you might not come out? Yes. Why? I held his gaze. Because they wouldn't, I said. That landed differently than anything else I'd said all night. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was just final. Jenna's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them back. Aunt Louise reached for her hand under the table. Mark looked down at his plate, then back up at me. I've never. He stopped, searching for the right words. I've never had to make a decision like that. No, I said gently. Most people don't. And that's a good thing. Frank let out a long, heavy breath. And that's something to be profoundly grateful for. Mark nodded faintly. I think I treated it like a story, he admitted. Like something you'd tell at a bar. Something exciting. That's how it looks from the outside, I said. And from the inside? I paused, thinking of the silence and the sound of my own breathing. From the inside, I said, it's mostly just waiting and hoping the people next to you can make it through the next 10 seconds. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now, a sound I hadn't even noticed before. Mark rubbed his hands together. I shouldn't have pushed you like that, he said. At the start. No, I agreed. He winced slightly at how direct I was. Then I softened it just a fraction. But you didn't know what you were pushing on, I added. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I said, but it makes it understandable. That seemed to matter to him. People his age, mid-40s, I guessed, still live in that space where they desperately want to be right. But they're starting to understand the value of being decent instead. Frank looked at him. What matters is what you do with that knowledge now. Mark nodded slowly. Then he looked at me again. I'm sorry, he said. This time was different. No hesitation. No performance. Just a man admitting he'd misjudged the person sitting across from him. I studied him for a second, then nodded back. Thank you. That was enough. We didn't need a bigger moment than that. Reconciliation, I've learned, doesn't come with a round of applause. It comes quietly in small sentences that people actually mean. Jenna exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. Okay, she said, forcing a small, brave smile. Can we maybe try to eat before everything gets cold? A few people chuckled softly. It wasn't a return to normal, but it was a step toward something livable. Plates were passed again. Someone poured more water. The ordinary rhythm of dinner resumed, though more gently now, as if everyone was suddenly aware of how quickly things could shift. Mark reached for the serving dish nearest him and passed it to me without a word. A small gesture, but a real one. Thanks, I said. He nodded. Across the table, Caleb asked Frank a quiet question about his time in Vietnam. For the first time that evening, the focus moved away from me. I was grateful. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I wanted to be part of the room again, not the center of it. Frank answered Caleb slowly, choosing his words with care. He wasn't glorifying or dramatizing. He was just telling the truth the way older veterans often do, plain, steady, and without any need to impress. I listened, and for the first time since I'd walked through the front door, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not quite comfort, but something very close to it. Jenna leaned toward me. I really am glad you came, she said softly. I looked at her. I almost didn't, I admitted. She smiled. I'm glad you did anyway. Me, too, I said. And I meant it. As uncomfortable as the evening had been, it had stripped away the surface assumptions and easy judgments. What was left wasn't perfect, but it was honest. After a while, Mark cleared his throat again. Can I ask you one more thing? I glanced at him. You can ask. He hesitated, then asked, Do you hate that nickname? The question surprised me, not because of the subject, but because of his tone. It was careful, respectful. I thought about it for a moment before giving him the truth. I don't hate it, I said. But I don't carry it the way other people think I do. What do you mean? I rested my hands on the table. It reminds me of what didn't go right, I said. Not just what did. Frank nodded almost to himself. That's the part civilians never see, he murmured. I looked back at Mark. It's not something I usually bring to dinner. He gave a small, understanding nod. Yeah, I see that now. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark. The reflections in the window showed all of us sitting there, older faces and younger ones, a mix of histories that had, for a brief moment, collided. Not perfectly, but honestly. And sometimes, at this stage of life, that's enough. Dinner didn't go back to what it had been. It couldn't. But it settled into something better. Quieter, maybe, and more deliberate. It was as if everyone at the table had been reminded that the people sitting across from them carried much more than just polite conversation. Frank leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests now instead of gripping the table. He looked older than he had an hour ago, but not weaker, just more present. Caleb asked him where he had served, and Frank answered without any heroic framing. Just dates, places, and the kind of details that matter more the older you get. I found myself listening closely. There's a shared language among veterans, even across generations. It's not about the words themselves, it's about how they're said. It's the way certain moments are left unspoken, because they don't require an explanation. Eventually, Jenna stood up to begin clearing the plates. I'll get dessert started, she said, her voice a little brighter, trying to bring some warmth back into the room. I'll help, I said, pushing my chair back. She shook her head. You stay. You've done enough for one night. There was a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. It was respect, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet kind that stays. I sat back down. Mark watched Jenna disappear into the kitchen, then looked at me. Hey. His voice was low, meant only for me. I turned toward him. Yeah? He hesitated, looking almost awkward. I meant what I said earlier. I know. He nodded, then added, I think I've spent a lot of my life thinking I understood people just by listening to them talk for a few minutes. I gave a faint smile. That's most people. Yeah, he said. But I was wrong tonight. There wasn't much to say to that, so I just said, that happens. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but softer. Not like this, he said. Across the table, Frank watched us, not interrupting, just aware. He had the look of someone who had seen this kind of moment before, the kind that doesn't come often but matters deeply when it does. Mark leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something else? You've been doing that all night, I replied, a hint of humor finally touching my voice. He caught it and smiled just a little. Yeah, but this one's different. I nodded. Go ahead. He lowered his voice. How do you come back from that? I knew exactly what he meant. Not the mission, not the nickname, but the life that comes after the smoke clears. I took a moment to find the answer. You don't come back the same, I said. He frowned slightly. Then what do? You build something new, I told him. Piece by piece. You figure out what still fits and what doesn't. That sounds hard. It is. Frank spoke from across the table. But it's also necessary. Mark glanced at him, then back at me. Do people help? I thought about that. Some do. Some don't know how. And tonight, he asked. I met his eyes. Tonight helped. That seemed to mean more to him than anything else I'd said. He sat back, absorbing it. Jenna returned with a tray, apple pie, still warm, served with small bowls of vanilla ice cream. The scent filled the room, cutting through the lingering heaviness in a way that felt almost symbolic. Okay, she said, setting it down. I think we've all earned this. There were a few soft laughs. Plates were passed again. This time, the conversation moved more naturally, not forced or overly careful, just respectful. Aunt Louise asked where I was living now. Caleb talked about his job. Someone mentioned the wedding again, and this time it didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like a reminder that life keeps moving forward. I answered when spoken to and listened when others shared. Slowly, I stopped feeling like an outsider at the table. After dessert, I stood up. I'm going to step outside for a minute, I said. Jenna looked at me. Everything okay? Yeah, I said. Just need some air. Take your time. I walked out the front door and onto the porch. The night air was cool and quiet. A soft breeze moved through the trees lining the street. For a moment, I just stood there in the dark. No voices, no questions, just the sound of distant traffic and the faint rustle of leaves. I rested my hands on the railing. This was the part people don't talk about. Not the mission or the aftermath, but the in-between moments, the ones where you stand still and try to feel like you belong somewhere that doesn't require you to be anything other than human. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn. I already knew who it was. Frank stepped out and stood beside me. He didn't say anything at first, just looked out at the quiet street. After a minute, he said, "You handled that well." I didn't handle it, I said. It just happened. He nodded slightly. That's usually how it goes. We stood in the silence for a while longer. Then he spoke again. Coming home isn't easy. No, I agreed. Never was, he added. Different wars, same problem. I glanced at him. You still feel it? He gave a faint smile. Some days more than others. I understood that perfectly. He looked at me then, his expression solemn. But nights like this help, he said. I considered that. Yeah, they do. He nodded once, then said something that stayed with me. People don't need to understand everything. They just need to be willing to respect what they don't understand. I let that settle in my mind. That's enough, I said. He smiled. Yes, it is. We stood there a little longer, not needing to talk. Inside, I could hear the voices again, softer now, warmer. Family. Not perfect, but real. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something worth staying for. Morning came quietly. I woke up in the guest room with that unfamiliar stillness you only find in someone else's house. No alarms, no radios, no distant hum of engines, just sunlight filtering through the blinds and the faint sound of movement from downstairs. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came back. The dinner, the long silences, Mark's face when the realization hit him, Frank's voice cutting through the tension. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the edge of the bed. My body still carried the habits of another life. Asterisk wake, assess, move. Asterisk even in a quiet Virginia home, those instincts didn't just vanish. But they were softening. Little by little. I got dressed and stepped into the hallway. The house already smelled of fresh coffee. Downstairs, Jenna was in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a mug in her hand. She turned when she saw me. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "Morning. You sleep okay?" "I did," I said. "Better than I expected." She nodded, knowing that meant more than just a few hours of rest. "I made coffee, and there's breakfast if you want some." "Coffee sounds perfect." I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter. For a moment, we just shared the quiet. "Last night," she began, looking at me. "I'm really glad you stayed." "So am I." She hesitated. "I hope it didn't feel like we were putting you on display." "It didn't," I said. That wasn't entirely true at first, but by the end, the feeling had shifted. "I think we all learned something," she added. I gave a small nod. "Yeah." Mark walked in then, moving slower than usual, looking like a man who'd been doing a lot of thinking before coming downstairs. He looked at me, then at Jenna, then back at me. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He stepped over to the coffee pot, poured a cup, and stood there for a second longer than necessary. Finally, he turned toward me. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me. "Which part?" "All of it," he said. "But mostly the part about not bringing that nickname to dinner." I held his gaze. "That one tends to stick with people." He nodded. "Yeah, it should." There was a pause. "I talked to Uncle Frank this morning." That didn't surprise me. And I asked him. He told me I was lucky. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Lucky?" "Lucky I learned that lesson at a dinner table," he said. "And not somewhere where it would have cost me a lot more." That sounded exactly like something Frank would say. "Sounds about right," I said. Mark let out a small breath. "I meant what I said last night about being wrong." "I know." He looked at me for a moment. "I don't think I've ever really thought about what people carry with them." "Not like that." "That's true for most people," I said again. He gave a faint smile. "Yeah, but I'd like to be better about it." That was the crucial difference. Not perfection, but the willingness to try. "That's enough," I said. Jenna watched our exchange quietly, her expression soft. "You two want breakfast?" she asked, breaking the moment just enough to keep it from getting too heavy again. "Sure," Mark said. I nodded. "Yeah." Later that morning, we sat at the same table. Same chairs. Same sunlight coming through the windows. But the atmosphere was entirely different. It wasn't tense or fragile, it felt settled. Conversation came easier, not forced, not overly careful, just real. Mark asked about my plans for the future, and this time it wasn't a curiosity meant to prove a point. It was genuine interest. I told him I was considering staying in Virginia for a while, maybe working with a veteran support group, or perhaps finding something even quieter. "That sounds like you," Jenna said. I smiled faintly. "I think it might be." Frank joined us halfway through, moving a bit slower than the night before, but steady as ever. He took his seat, looked around the table, and gave a small, satisfied nod. "Better morning," he said. "Yes, sir," Mark replied. Frank looked at him for a second, then allowed himself a slight smile. "Good," he said. That was all he said, but the word carried a heavy, quiet weight that filled the room. By late morning, it was time for me to take my leave. I stood near the front door, my bag gripped in my hand, feeling the finality of the visit. Jenna stepped forward and hugged me again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I returned the embrace fully. "Come back for the wedding," she said, her voice hopeful. "I will." Mark stepped forward next. He wavered for a split second, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face, before he finally held out his hand. I took it, his grip firm and sincere. "Drive safe," he said. "I will." There was a brief, heavy pause. He looked like he wanted to say more, and then he did. "And thank you." "For what?" "For not shutting me out," he said quietly. I gave him a single, solemn nod. "You gave me a reason not to." Those words seemed to settle deep within him, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge we had started to build. Frank walked me out to the porch. As I stepped into the morning air, he turned to me. "You did more than you realized last night," he said, his eyes steady. "I just told the truth," I replied simply. "That's usually enough," he answered. He paused, then added, "Take care of yourself." "I will." I got into my car and sat there for a long moment, just as I had the night before. Everything was physically the same worn seat, the same familiar steering wheel, but the feeling inside me had shifted entirely. The house behind me wasn't just a place I'd pass through anymore. It was somewhere I could finally come back to. I turned the key and the engine hummed to life. As I began to pull away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Mark and Jenna were standing together in the doorway, with Frank anchored just behind them. 3 different generations, 3 very different lives, all shifted just a little bit by the honesty of a single dinner. I don't find myself thinking about the old nickname much anymore. Mad Dog was never a title I wore with pride. It was a burden, something I carried because I had to. But that night reminded me of something vital. People don't necessarily need to understand every scar you carry or everything you've endured. They just need to meet you with respect the moment they realize how much they don't know. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they learn, they grow, and you find yourself changing right along with them. If you've ever been misjudged, or if you've been the one to judge someone else too quickly, you might understand how these small, quiet moments can leave a permanent mark on a soul. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll take a second to reflect on the people sitting around your own table, the ones you think you already know. Maybe share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Because respect, when given honestly, has a way of coming back around. And those quiet lessons? Those are the ones that stay with you forever.